Life. I'm focused in the regulations unit, and my role is to serve as the coordinator for the scientific collecting permit program, namely because there's multiple units within the department that actually implement this particular program. And so Leslie and myself will be sort of doing a tag team presentation to kind of give you an overview of SCPs as well as other authorities for authorizing take for scientific purposes. Sure we're advancing. Okay. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, we'll be discussing a little bit about the background for take in California and focusing on the definition according to the state. That'll help you understand in what circumstances do you actually need a permit when you're conducting take for scientific purposes in different watersheds or different environments. And so we'll be going over the 3 different authorities that exist that are able to authorize take for scientific purposes. And I'll be focusing my part of the talk on scientific collecting permits per se. And then Leslie will be talking in more depth about California endangered species under the California Endangered Species Act, as well as fully protected species and the permit mechanism to authorize their take. Oops. And then I'll go into a little bit about how the permit process for SCP works, as well as how to apply for one, and what the planned improvements are that we're working on with the regulations update. That is my primary responsibility. And then Leslie will go over some special considerations for invertebrate and BMI sampling techniques. So for those of you who aren't familiar with our definition of take for the state, it's under Fish and Game Code Section 86, which basically means that you can take wildlife to pursue, hunt, catch, capture, or kill. Or anytime you attempt to do any of these activities, you're basically in need of having a permit or some other authorization from the state to do so. For purposes of scientific collecting permits, you basically need to be able to do it for scientific education and propagation purposes primarily. And this is basically purposes that are geared towards some sort of data collection that you're doing with the wildlife that you're taking that can then be reported back to the department that helps to inform how those species and their habitats are managed. And so the SCP is the appropriate mechanism for take for any species that are not listed by the state. So they're not in California endangered species, or they're not fully protected species, but they may be restricted species. They may be game species, non-game species, and they may also be California species of special concern. So the SCB would be your appropriate mechanism for take for those particular set of species. So under the California Endangered Species Act, or CESA, those species that are threatened, endangered, or candidate would require a particular permit called a Memorandum of Understanding, or an MOU, depending on the nature of your work with a given species or set of species. And then the third authorization authority would be under the fully protected statutes. There's 4 sections here. They're for birds, mammals, herpetofauna, and fish. And they're implemented in Title 14 under this regulatory section. And so that permit mechanism to authorize take would also be an MOU. Okay. So when we talk about take, we're talking about sort of 2 different levels of coverage that you need to take into account when you're requesting take for a permit application. And the first of which is when you're actually targeting a species or a set of species in an environment. So your whole entire goal is to actually capture or maybe sacrifice these species depending on your study objectives. And so we have in the background on this slide, we have sort of like a stream environment. And if you're conducting benthic macroinvertebrate sampling and you're using methods such as a D or a kick net, it's possible that you could be taking the invertebrates that you're kicking up into the net, because that's what you're actually targeting. But another level that you need to take into consideration is the fact that you may be kicking other things into the net that aren't actually what you're looking or trying to catch. And so using a D or a kick net, you might be actually disturbing habitat that can cause perhaps small fish to enter the net in the area that you're working in, or it may stir up larval amphibians that are present in a given stream, such as tap holes or potentially larval salamanders. And so it's important to note when you're applying for a permit to note what your target species is, and also, if you can, to the extent feasible, identify what you suspect you might be catching incidentally as bycatch. And this is important because it helps the department evaluate your application for take for scientific purposes, while also helping ensure that you are covered for the take that you are incurring through your target, but also things that can be captured incidentally. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple slides. So permits are reviewed for all three of the mechanisms, CISA, fully protected, and for SCPs, following these three general review programs in the department. And these are the Fisheries, Marine, and Wildlife Review Programs. So depending on the nature of your taxonomic groups, they may be reviewed by entirely different groups of people in the department. So for the Wildlife Review Program, they're primarily responsible for review of applications for take for amphibians, birds, mammals, reptiles, and vernal pool invertebrates, or invertebrates that are sort of in their aerial phase, or terrestrial invertebrates occurring in otherwise non-aquatic environments. And the Marine Review Program is responsible for reviewing applications for take for marine invertebrates, marine algae, marine fish, including anadromous fish captured in marine waters, and marine plants. And then lastly, the Fisheries Review Program is responsible for the review of application for take for anadromous fish and freshwater fish that are captured or taken in inland waters, and for aquatic freshwater invertebrates. And so this is to help you understand that whenever you are applying for BMI sampling or take authorization, or for your part of the swamp program, that your authorization would fall under the Fisheries Review Program. So when it comes to SCPs, I wanted to go over a concept that best explains how a permit holder, when an SCP is issued to a permit holder, has a certain responsibility that's then delegated down through sort of this hierarchy of supervision. And so this term adequate supervision is within the permitting authority for any take for scientific purposes in California. So both SCPs and MOUs for CISA, or fully protected species, would implement a similar hierarchy to this. And it might be similar to how you might be familiar with the concept of being a sub-permittee, or maybe a co-investigator on a particular study for another permit you may have. And so we have this idea of an entity SCP, which is basically an SCP that can be issued to a particular affiliation or an organization that involves a principal investigator who has the responsibility and oversight to know and abide by all the laws and regulations for the take of wildlife, as well as be well aware of the conditioning that's been placed on a particular permit. And they will also be responsible for training and informing the staff, the field staff that work underneath them, of these same things, and making sure that those staff are well trained up on the techniques for handling for take, and to be able to minimize effects of that take. So the principal investigator basically can adequately oversee a list of authorized individuals. And so these folks, again, are able to work independently on their own in the field under the adequate supervision of a principal investigator. So they've been fully trained up and tried and are trusted to do the work on their own without being directly overseen by the principal investigator. And so those authorized individuals are then able to work with any temporary or seasonal field staff that might be around and assisting with any field work. And so those field assistants, those temporary or seasonal staff, need to be directly supervised, meaning within some sort of communication distance from by the authorized individuals or by the principal investigator. So that's kind of the hierarchy of how it works for delegation of supervision in the field. And it's it's a concept that is, again, applied to both SCPs and MOUs. There's two other permit holder types for scientific collecting permits. They are having an individual SCP, where you're basically choosing to just work with yourself as maybe as an individual researcher, and you're not affiliating with any particular company or organization. And student SCPs are also another permit holder type, and that particular permit is associated with a slightly reduced permit fee. But their role is really similar in terms of how they're acting responsibly, and they basically act in the same way that a principal investigator would on an entity permit. However, they don't have the ability to, at this time, correctly actually have a list of authorized individuals. So right now, they only have the ability to directly oversee take that happens by field assistants in the field, but that's something that we're working on doing with the regulations update, is to allow for individuals to actually have their own lists of authorized individuals. And so the important thing to note for permitting in general is that anyone who wants to have the ability to conduct work independently needs to be named on all state and federal permits. So that's something important to note. So if you have some staff that you want to have the flexibility to have them work in the field, then you need to make sure that their names are submitted with the permit application for approval. So the current SCP process is basically involves checking out our department's webpage right here for the latest application, downloading it and filling it out. There's 5 main sections of the application. Sections 1 through 4 are more about the demographic information for the permit holder, and it goes into detail where you can request what type of taxonomic groups you're interested in. So for instance, if you're interested in targeting freshwater fish and rodents, you would basically apply to the freshwater fisheries permit program and the wildlife review program. And you would also identify if you have any people that you're collaborating with, and identify the permit ID numbers of those particular researchers. And then section 5 is the meat and potatoes, so to speak, of the entire application, where you're providing details to justify why you need to do this work and the benefit that it might have to the resources. So identifying a purpose, your locations, the dates you plan to be sampling, and specifics on the capture methods and procedures that you plan to do to the animals that you take. And so, along with a couple of other pieces of information, such as any, permits that might be paired with the work that you're requesting to do, federal or otherwise, you would basically send the whole application package to our license and revenue branch at the department. And so, this whole process applies for permits that you're coming into the system and you're requesting a new permit, or if you're renewing your existing permit, or if you want to come in to amend an existing permit, you would basically go through the same process, although the amendment has sort of a separate form than the new and renewal application does. So now that we've talked a little bit about how to fill out and submit your application, when they do come into license and revenue branch, those taxonomic groups that you indicated on your application are what will determine who's reviewing your particular application. So again, they'll go to the 3 different review programs, depending on what you've selected. And it goes through 2 basic phases of review. The first of which is to ensure that all the information that's requested on the application has at first glance been provided. So you filled out all the demographic information, you've attached any necessary permits that might be paired with your work, perhaps a statement of qualifications, depending on what you're requesting to do. And so there might be some back and forth with the reviewer and the applicant at that time to make sure that the application is complete. After which it'll go through a review for content, which is kind of the longer part of the review process. And that's because the nature of your justification might be scrutinized pretty closely, because this is the level at which the locations and the capture methods or the procedures that you're planning to conduct will then be evaluated by a couple different folks. And those folks are dispersed across the department generally, depending on which locations you indicated in your application. So by that I mean the application might be sent to regional biologists in the department who happen to be subject matter experts or geographic location experts. They know a lot more about a particular species and their population in a given area. And so they will be reviewing your application and making sure that what you've proposed doesn't necessarily conflict with any, say, ongoing departmental studies that are happening, or that they may not conflict with other permittees or permit holders who are doing similar work in similar locations. Because keeping in mind that there's thousands of permittees with SCPs or MOUs across the state, and that they're all kind of doing work in some locations, so that the work might be overlapping. So that's something that we need to evaluate from our end. So that process may involve a little bit more back and forth with the applicant to make sure and refine the details of the justification. And so if you're applying for BMI or swamp work, this particular stage, the review for content, would be where we basically check that swamp has been indicated on the application, and it basically gets sent directly to the aquatic bioassessment lab, where Jim and his staff will review it and make sure they've attached any conditioning language that they wish to include on there. The regional biologist in the particular region that you plan to sample might also have some comments. And so the take that you're requesting would then be conditioned, and there might be some restrictions, or there might be some flexibilities given depending on what you have been proposing. And then the permit would then be issued through the License and Revenue Branch back to you. And currently it's mailed back to you, but we're hoping that'll change in the future. One thing I wanted to mention, that we're under current directorate requirement, to the extent feasible that we can, to actually get permits out within 90 days. So we're trying our best to get permits from, once we get them taken into our system, to get them out and reviewed and conditioned and out to you within 3 months. So that's something we've been pretty successful on and continuing to strive for. And so based on kind of the things I mentioned with the permit process and application that we have now, my primary role is to work on improving the SCP program specifically. And so we're working on a regulations update for the section 650 and title 14, which is basically 20 years out of date. So there's a lot of improvements to be made. And it's one of the more complicated departmental rulemakings, namely because it touches upon so many different aspects of the department's organizational chart. But nonetheless, we've been working to clarify the regulatory language by providing new definitions that didn't exist before, and providing better detail for what needs to be in a permit justification. Everything from qualifications to language for enforcement. And a lot of this was made possible by conducting a pre-notice outreach period last spring, where we did our best to integrate the over 400 comments that we received during that period into the regulatory language, as well as the regulatory package in general. And so based on some of the comments we received, we're looking to come forward with a sort of a proposed revised permitting structure that is more based on the 3 review programs and the nature of how permits are reviewed in the department. So with that revised structure that we're proposing, we'll have a couple new forms, some of which we're hoping will be electronic by the time we're effective, looking at end of first or second quarter of next year. And some of those forms may still be on paper, or like PDF versions. So based on that idea, we are hoping that the application, when we're rolling things out with the reg change, will actually be online, even if we are in beta testing, but it will be online. And again, the end of first or second quarter of next year, to be followed by later online improvements that are also going to be sort of phased in as we go. And so the status of the rulemaking, the best way to stay up to date is check out our website. Otherwise, I'm sure you'll hear about it from your colleagues or other folks who are participating in research studies. So that's pretty much all I have. And Leslie, I think, will be coming up and telling you more about CISA and fully protected MOUs, how to apply for them, and other considerations for BMI sampling. So you want to use...
Me all right? Okay. My name is Leslie Alber. I work for Fisheries Branch, and mainly what I work on is permitting. And I do SCPs for deauthorizations and CISA and fully protected MOUs. Some of the common application errors that we see for permitting is specifically to SCPs is in the justification section that we often get inadequate details, most of the time pertaining to locations, capture methods, or procedures. So for example, sometimes applicants will give a justification that says something along the lines of minnow traps will be used to capture juvenile fish, when in actuality what we really need is a description of the minnow traps that includes, are those traps baited, what locations are they set in, how long will they be soaked for, how often will they be checked, how many traps are you going to set, what size are they, and what mesh size are they. So we need a little bit more detail than just the example above. Another thing we often see is missing target and bycatch take numbers, and I will talk about an exception a little bit later for freshwater invertebrates. But this is, we're not looking for exact numbers of take here. We're looking for your best guess estimate based on previous data. And this information is valuable for knowing, This information is valuable for knowing how much take is actually being approved, and it can be modified with approval if it needs to be modified, so it's not something that's set in stone. If you give an estimated take number, it doesn't leave it to where you don't have the option to modify your take. Fisheries methods are very indiscriminate, and they almost always result in take of bycatch. And so by identifying the bycatch species, what that allows us to do is to actually give you some authorized take for those species, as opposed to finding yourself in a situation where you don't have authorization for that take and you have to stop work if that take occurs. So some of the potential effects on target and bycatch species are often left out of applications. In your application, you should be describing how you're going to minimize or avoid effects on both your target and bycatch species. If you do not feel that your capture methods will result in any bycatch at all, you can include that in your application and why your methods you don't feel would actually result in bycatch. That can help with the permitting process as far as letting the reviewers know that the method that you're using has no potential to catch species we may be concerned about in certain locations. Another thing we often see is missing permit information. So you should always be aware of other state and federal permits that you need that might be associated with your request. These could be for either your target species or your bycatch species, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in some later slides. So CISA MOUs are issued for state-listed species, either threatened, endangered, or candidate species. And they're issued for the purposes of scientific, education, or management. And they can be issued to individuals, public agencies, universities, zoological gardens, and scientific or educational institutions. And fully protected MOUs are issued only for fully protected species. And the fully protected species protection is the state's initial efforts from the 60s to protect animals that were rare or faced with extinction. Since the 60s, all fully protected species have also now been listed by CISA. However, the prohibitions against take for fully protected species override CISA. So if If you're going to take one of those species, you would be required to get a fully protected MOU. And fully protected MOUs can only be used for fully protected fish for necessary scientific research that's for the recovery of fully protected species or other state-listed species. So the information that we require to obtain a CISA or a fully protected MOU is similar to what we ask for SCPs. You'll be asked to give permit holder information and information regarding the purpose, the sampling season, capture methods and procedures, and the take and location information for the work you're requesting. For both CISA and fully protected MOUs, you can contact me at Fisheries Branch, and I will put you in touch with the appropriate review program, which may be myself or a regional biologist. One thing to note for when you're applying for fully protected MOUs is that there is a statutory 30-day public notice process that's called the Public Information Notice, or PIN. And Fisheries Branch prepares the PIN. It's just a summary describing the work proposed. It'll reference any federal permit numbers for any federally listed species that you have. And then once the PIN is prepared, we would submit that to the Office of Administrative Law. It would then be put on a list to be published in the California Regulatory Notice Register. And once it's published, it will be in the register for a 30-day public comment review. If we do get comments back, the department would work with the applicant to address all those comments. But the big thing to note here is this is a lengthy process, so getting a fully protected MOU is usually not quick. At minimum, you have to wait the 30 days, and that doesn't include preparing the MOU itself. So it can be very confusing determining which kind of permit you need for coverage for your work. And you always have to keep in mind both your target and your bycatch species. So, for example, if you are going to be targeting something like fall run chinook or have them as bycatch, they're a non-state listed species, that would require an SCP. If you're going to get a federally listed species either as target or bycatch, that would require you to get an SCP, and in addition, a federal permit, usually a Section 10A1A or 4D. If you're going to get target or bycatch species that are state listed or fully protected, that would require you to get an MOU from the department. And if you are required to get coverage for target or bycatch that is state listed or fully protected and is also federally listed, then you would need to get an MOU and a federal permit, Section 10A1A or 4D. So, for example, if you were doing a project where you were going to target steelhead, for your target species, you would need to get the SCP and the federal coverage because they are non-state listed but federally listed fish. However, if that same project is going to have bycatch of, say, coho and fall run chinook salmon, then you would also need to get the MOU for the coverage for the coho because they are state listed, and you would need to include the fall run chinook in your SCP because they are non-state listed. One thing that's important to note here also is that state and federal permits never supersede or take the place of one or the other. So if the species is both federally and state listed, you would still need both permits to have coverage for that species. So some of the considerations that are made specific to BMI work and applications with participants are participating in the SWAMP program when it comes to scientific take are things like locations for sampling. We understand that at the time of the application, the specific locations are not always known. This is difficult for reviewers because if we don't know where you're sampling, then I don't know where to send your permit for review. So the more specific the location, the better. However, even if we get broad location information, like even a county, I can at least figure out like which regional biologist I should send it to for review. The benefit to more specific locations is if your work is being done in a very specific place where we know that there's no potential for bycatch of sensitive species that we're worried about, it's easy to say, yeah, this is fine, you can do your work here. As opposed to if you're doing it at a county-wide level, there's a lot of stuff going on in a county. It makes it difficult for the biologist to determine whether or not we have concerns. One of the exceptions we do make is if there is no way that you can tell us any location information, we can condition a permit to basically state that you have to contact a regional fisheries biologist prior to any sampling. So another consideration would be the potential for bycatch of sensitive species. And even though SWAMP and other BMI sampling methods can be standardized, it's important to have the applicants evaluate the potential for capture of sensitive species. And by sensitive species, we're talking about either listed species or species of special concern. And that can be done a few ways. You can check our website. The CNDDB and the special animals list are both there. They tell you the listing status. The special animal list tells you the listing status of the species, and the CNDDB is more of a mapping tool, and we do have a new layer that we just actually released to the public it's called the California Native Fish Species by Watershed layer, and it can be a useful tool. It does have limitations, but basically what it is a layer where you could plot a point, and it tells you by HUC how it's basically a density map on how many listed or fish species of concern are in that area. The downfall is that since it is by HUC, just because the HUC shows a listed species doesn't mean that species is necessarily exactly where you're doing your work. But it is a place to start, give you a little bit of information on what fish species of concern are in general areas. Another thing to consider is the habitat even suitable for species that we might be concerned about? For example, if there's seasonal or perennial flow and the watershed's going to dry up, most fish species can't survive that. So you can mention stuff like that in your application. If you know that you're going to be sampling in an area that this occurs, we wouldn't have the concerns we might have otherwise for fish. And lastly, does the gear that you're using even have the potential to capture any of the non-target species that we might be concerned about? And lastly, expected take numbers. As I said before, this is just a best estimate based on previous data. And the exception that I was talking about earlier is that if you're going to do work where you're going to be sampling for invertebrates and those invertebrates aren't going to be identified on site, then we would not require take numbers for those types of samples. So in summary, we've gone over the state definition of take, scientific authorities, and specifically SCPs and MOUs for authorizing take of wildlife, and the permit application process and contact information, and considerations for BMI and invertebrate sampling. So with that, we have Here's the email addresses for the 3 permitting programs. You can also find this information on the website, and you can contact me under Fisheries Branch if you have any questions about MOUs or SCPs or any other general permitting questions. You can also email the website in the bottom corner, and Ona will filter those emails and send them to whoever the appropriate contact would be. And that's also her phone number down there. And also we appreciate the work by LRB, our License and Revenue Branch, the Biogeographic Data Branch, and Jim Harrington and Peter Ode and others at the Aquatic Bioassessment Lab. And thanks for listening. I think we have time for a few questions.
Well, yeah, we're 15 minutes over, but I want to get an idea, how many